like our presenters are here. Welcome, Janine and Kern. All right, so I'm just gonna take a second to introduce you all before we get started in your presentation. So just a little personal story. When I first heard of Janine and Kern, I was listening to a podcast from the Center for Whole Communities, and they have a podcast called the Dive In podcast, and that's where I heard Janine speak of the work of Six World Solutions, and specifically the work that her and Kern are doing with Navajo nations across the U.S. So in previous meetings at the collaborative, we've talked about our collaborative agreements, and a lot of us spoke about who should be at the table, or who's at the table that hasn't been included that should be here. And on our bullet points, indigenous communities were like continuously popped up, especially because it's farm to school. A lot of us work in food and in agriculture and in organizing. So the collaborative genuinely wants to intentionally start making, you know, intentional relationships with indigenous communities. So Six World Solutions isn't specifically based in Connecticut, um, although they do have connections with Navajo nations in Connecticut and all over. So they're great people to learn from. Um, and yeah, we're excited to learn from you today, Janine. And thank you so much for being here. And I'll give you the floor. Let me know if you need anything.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. There's feedback.
Okay.
All right. Yeah, thank you, everyone. Really awesome to be here. Sorry we're a little late. Rural issues. Sometimes when we wake up, we don't have internet, and it's always fun to find out at the last minute. But yes, so to start off, my name is Janine Yazzie. I'm a land rights and human rights defender. I work with my nation, the Navajo Nation, here in the Southwest United States. So I guess the first point of correction is Navajo Nation is a unique nation, and we are one of many indigenous peoples and tribes. We don't have any lands or peoples up in Connecticut. Connecticut has a different configuration of Algonquin speaking indigenous peoples. Particularly close to you all is the Pequot Nation, which is a very different nation from my peoples. But we have expressed with Nairi some connections that we could put her in contact with. I know at the University of Connecticut, one of my biggest investors is Professor Sandy Grand, who's an amazing Quechua woman and scholar, and who has championed and developed a whole new area of scholarship for educating Indigenous educators. And yeah, so really excited to talk and do a small presentation, I guess, on sort of the work that we're doing and how we've built collaborative relationships with different partners in the areas of food security and food sovereignty. And I want to go ahead and let my husband and partner introduce himself. We're both on different computers, but mine's the only one that has a camera. So
Hi, everyone. Can they hear me?
yeah. Here, let me take this off.
Oh, the sound went out, guys.
Cool.
Okay.
I'm Collymore, Afro-Caribbean. Grew up in well, I was born in Trinidad and Tobago. I grew up in Staten Island, New York. And for the past 10 years, I've been living, working, activating on the Navajo reservation, focused on food security, land restoration, and water rights. Yeah, I think that's.
Yeah. So we'll go ahead and I'm glad I see someone knows Sandy. Thank you, Luke. Yes, her book is phenomenal. She just had another book as well that got released. So amazing connection there already in your university. And so, all right, we'll tell you a little bit about ourselves. We moved back to my homelands in 2010. After we both completed schooling. I went to Barnard College. I met my husband who went to Columbia University. And we both decided after graduating that the life that we wanted for ourselves and for our children wasn't possible in Manhattan. Especially since we had our son, he was a year old, and we were already being consumed in a lifestyle where we'd leave. My husband wouldn't see our child, like he'd leave while he was still sleeping and come back while he was already in bed. And that was just like the life cycle. And we had a hard reflection about what is meaningful, what is important, and what we wanted for our children. And a lot of it was around wanting to raise our children in community. And so this is a very real reality that we face on in many of our reservations. Half our populations of most Indigenous peoples are living outside their homelands in urban areas. This is because it's the message that we get that the opportunities are elsewhere, therefore we have to leave our homes. And that messaging sort of negates and erases why there are so little opportunities in our reservation lands and what those challenges and issues are. And so when we moved back, we kind of came back with a dream to build our own homestead and to figure out how do we support ourselves and build a business while sharing those skills and building those skills in community. And it was a simple dream that became a very complex career in a variety of ways. One of the big things to know about Indigenous partners is that we don't have the luxury to be issue focused and to it's actually a privilege to be able to choose one stream of work and dedicate and build careers around that. It just doesn't work that way. And working on food security, the biggest issue we're still facing is water insecurity and the issues around how unjust legal systems and interpretations of who can claim water rights has mitigated and threatened our ancestral rights to our very precious, very limited water resources in our communities. But we can't talk about water rights and water issues and water access without also addressing the endemic of environmental contamination in our communities. And that has come from generations of resource exploitation. And so if I wish I could show you this, maybe if I have time later, I'll show you, but like I've made a very elementary map and graphic to show kind of the situation that we're in. But the Navajo Nation in itself is one of the largest land-based nations, with the exception of the recent court win of our Cherokee relatives in Oklahoma, which determined that half of Oklahoma is Indian land. So we're very excited for them. But up until that point, Navajo Nation was the largest land-based tribe. In Connecticut, you have very small nations, nations that have been, who've had their homeland stripped away and have been left with a very small fraction of their ancestral homelands. And so with that said, the boundaries of our nation also come with very complicated jurisdictional authorities that make it very hard to do things as simple as starting community gardens. A lot of times the biggest owners of land on our reservations are churches. And churches have come and set up lands and claimed lands in places that have fertile soil, that have access to dependable water resources. And so when you map out where our resources are, where the best places are for food security projects and to restore our natural food systems, even the history of where they used to be, it becomes very evident that even though we've been given and demarcated and territorial boundary, so much of the lands that we need to sustain our communities and to continue our traditional lifeways and restore our traditional food systems are under private control. And so that was one of the complications we face. The other complication is that the history of the destruction of our food systems very much resulted from the conflicts with the United States. And so in the peace agreements and in the establishment of so-called peacetime measures on our reservations, the authorities were and the rules and laws were written so that the United States still maintains control over when and where and how we produce food in our own homelands. And so this results in such things like the eastern portion of the Navajo Nation, which lies in the state of New Mexico, being one of the only parts of the reservation that has settled water rights. And part of it, it was considered a big win because it's, I guess, a sizable amount of paper water rights that then got translated into wet water rights with a huge infusion of resources to build agricultural infrastructure to support an industry that is Navajo owned called the Native American Products Industry. And so when that area was established and all of these lands were withdrawn to start large scale agricultural fields, the way that it was structured was to lease out those fields. And so the majority of those fields are actually owned or leased to non-native corporations like Lay's and Frito Chips. And I forget what some of the other big brand names are. And so when in 2015, when we experienced the Gold King mine spill, again, because of like the endemic of environmental contamination and its impact on our water and soil resources, the Gold King mine spill turned the primary water source for many of our traditional farmers along the San Juan yellow. And it devastated those communities for 2 growing seasons, having huge repercussions on their fields, on the prevalence and accessibility to traditional foods. And it really shifted an entire community-based economy from 2015 to 2016. And even though they were living on the San Juan River, which we had water rights to, it turned out that the water rights that we supposedly had could only be used for the Native American products industry. So all of the non-native farmers who leased out those lands like weathered that storm unscathed, whereas we could not divert or use any of those waters to support and sustain our traditional farmers and their farmlands and their production. Another issue that we have in the way these laws and these regulations are interpreted is that most traditional farms, most traditional ways of farming are not recognized by the United States, particularly because they take a different approach. It's not about monocultural development. It's not based on capital. It's not based on profits. It's based on sustainability and diversification of food sources. It is based on protecting and preserving heirloom seeds. So there's a lot of like strict restrictions around use of pesticides and the ways that we farm in order to protect the integrity of our heirloom seeds. And all of this comes into conflict with the way that we have been assimilated over time into monocultural, large-scale agricultural production. And so when it came to us trying to really be part of the movement and contribute to the movement to restore traditional food systems, this became a huge conflict because here in the Southwest, in a very high desert area where we've been dealing with a persistent drought for the last 20 years that is only predicted to get worse for the next 20 years, dryland farming is a key part of how we build and sustain our food systems. And yet it wasn't until 2018, after 20 years of advocacy, that the USDA Farm Bill finally recognized dryland farming as an appropriate and legitimate form of agricultural development. And they also, I think, use finally accepted in like 2 places the term traditional ecological practices. Now, the work that I do because of these reasons is both a local and regional as well as international. because when we're confronting a lot of these domestic challenges and issues, it becomes very hard to work your way around it when everything about the system of power and the structure of power and the way resources are given and trickled into Native communities is meant and structured to uphold those structures of power. So it becomes very hard. We have our hands tied in so many ways. And this is why so many Indigenous farmers don't have access to USDA programs and the resources that are available to them. Another example is the focus on privatizing certain land bases and properties. One of the big requirements for USDA funding for farmers and for livestock owners is they have to have their lands fenced in and they have to show clear ownership over their lands, when our reservations were never structured in that way. And so that becomes an insurmountable thing to surpass in order to qualify for all of the funding that ends up floating around. And that's why so many non-Native organizations and institutions then access those funds, because they see it there. They're being given presentations on the accessibility of those funds, and they become the vehicles and the holders of power when they control the mechanisms by which those funds then get trickled into Native communities. And then the problem is that we often see those programs, as well-intentioned as they are, come in without any understanding of the history and the real context that is preventing food security and food sovereignty in our communities. And so a lot of the projects end up having very paternalistic and patronizing tones and assumptions that are very harmful and disempowering to our communities and to our farmers. Basically talking about how they're going to come and educate community members on how to build sustainable food systems, right? Without ever addressing that the reason why we don't have food systems is because of the ongoing colonization of our lands, territories, and resources. The rich history that we have of having edible landscapes, of having traditions and knowledge systems that tell us how to both cultivate and steward wild foods and wild medicines, while also cultivating and taking care of integrated what we would well now know as agroecological farm systems. And so all of these new terms that end up getting developed end up being repackaged to us, even though we have so many things to offer to inform what the proper strategies need to be and how this needs to be done. And so my work internationally is really about using the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the human rights-based frameworks to ensure that partnerships and that programs that come into Indigenous lands are held accountable in upholding those rights of Indigenous peoples, even if they're not recognized by the state or the federal government. But the US government does have that obligation to uphold that, as well as the obligation to uphold treaty rights. And so I took most of the time, and I really apologize. So I'm going to go ahead and let my partner talk about this, because in our partnership and in our work, it's about tackling both settler colonialism and the ongoing impacts of colonization, but also tackling the issues of racial equity and anti-Blackness as it exists in our communities, which is something that is very important for the tribes surrounding your area, because a lot of them are mixed Black, they're Black Indigenous. And that's been used as a way to minimize and delegitimize their claims of indigeneity, as well as to exercise a different type of prejudice against their communities.
Yeah, hi everyone. So yeah, I do a lot of work on farm to school, a lot of work engaging with food systems. I always say Janine is the brains, and I'm the, when she's not here, I say I'm the looks. But yeah, Janine is the brain, and I do a lot of on the ground work. And as Janine mentioned, it's really it's funny to look and see how things are packaged in different communities. I used to work at the school on the Upper East Side of New York City called the Buckley School. Barron Trump just graduated from there 2 years ago. So it's like one of those like high class schools according to them. And I remember parents paying $1,000 per kid to go to this farm in upstate New York, and these kids, like, we used to grow pumpkins in the little courtyard and all these things. So then after that, we moved out to the reservation, and obviously me with like, oh, like I know things, and trying to get the school district to let our kids just go to a farm was one of the hardest things ever, right? And to me, like, seeing that disconnect between like wealthy families making sure their kids are engaging in these things, and then for me, like in these indigenous communities, seeing how, right, like these regulations were set in place where it was so hard for us to be able to go on a field trip to a farm, so hard for us to look at food security in terms of like processing meat and these things. And then again, hearing these new initiatives where we do have, I'm talking about, I recently saw where in one of these northern tribes, they were processing elk, and it was a big class where all the kids would come in and they would like process the elk and they'd break it down. And like those things have been shown to be so good for kids learning, and just seeing the difficulty with that. And as we move forward with farm to school and this work that we've been doing out here, all the different USDA hoops that you have to hop through to be able to get, right? Like now we're at the point where we can grow food in the garden, but the kids can't eat it at school, right? They have to take the food home before they're able to eat it. And just all those different red tape is kind of what we've been fighting for these past couple of years. And I think, Janine and I have a really good collaboration because, as I said before, I'm very much like on the ground, where this is going on, where schools are doing it, who's working on these things. And Janine has been really good at connecting these international movements and seeing how, it's a similar struggle and more people are doing here and what people are doing in other places. So I don't want to go on too long, but that's just some of the work that I've been engaging in and seeing about how, connecting it back to this food security and Janine's conversation around indigenous communities, but just how like these rules and regulations do make it really hard for people on the ground, for people who are engaging in these things, to do the things that we say we want to engage in. So I don't want to go too much further. I know we have about 3 minutes now to answer questions. Janine actually is getting her cast off today. She broke her arm longboarding, and we've been like counting down the days. So Janine's gonna hop on the phone and get back on this call, but I just want to let y'all know where we're at. So yeah.
I'm on.
Oh, okay. Hey, Janine. So thank you so much to the both of you. Now we have time for questions. So anyone who has had any reflections, or I don't know, now's your time to come off of mute or use the chat to, have some dialogue.
I have a question. This is Shannon. Have you had any luck or experience with bringing indigenous meals and food and dishes into the school cafeteria, with developing recipes using using the native foods from the farm and from the region and from the Navajo culture in the district, like to get those recipes in there?
Yeah, most definitely. And at the end of the day, right, like in general, we're not monolithic. There are certain school boards or school districts that have superintendents that are all for bringing in food, and this is one of the things I say is kind of unfortunate, but sometimes you'll have a teacher that's really passionate about food security, and they'll do everything that they can while they're there to engage in this. And that does include bringing in foods, like definitely includes bringing in recipes. There's organizations that work on things like that. There's Gloria Begay. She's been heading up the Dene Food Security Alliance, DFSA. And their biggest movement for the past 6 years has been trying to get more and more food grown in schools across the reservation. Not just like having one teacher. And the thing that happens with that is that a lot of us have a lot of turnover. Our superintendents are here for 2-3 years at the most. superintendents are usually the ones who are guiding the structures of the school. So if every 2 years you have a brand new turning over of direction, the things that were done before start to fall to the wayside, unless you have these like amazing teachers. And again, our teacher holding on to teachers is also like a huge problem out here. For many different reasons, but yeah, so there has been like success in those things, and there have been people again engaging in food security, engaging in bringing in those traditional foods, and it's been shown that eating food from where you're from has been shown to be like a health benefit. There was a study in Philadelphia where they did on like African American men, and they gave them like a traditional African diet. I can't remember from what country it was from in Africa, but that diet included a bunch of like roots, like cassavas and things like that, and their health, like like blood pressure went down, like the fats that they had like went down. And the same thing for out here. There's certain foods where things like blue corn mush has been shown to have different vitamins and minerals that are really important for like body consumption. So looking at those things has been ongoing. And it's this work that's still being done, but there needs to be so much more research into this. There needs to be so much more work on looking at how we get more and more of these foods into our communities, and not just like, as I mentioned before, not just one school's or one district's initiative, but a nationwide thing.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, one of the biggest challenges for getting traditional foods into these places is that the overall policy that superintendents who don't want to like collaborate or find ways around end up drawing on is like USDA policies, and what does it what qualifies as being USDA safe. And so one of the initiatives that we have going on, one of our a dear colleague that is in the fight for food sovereignty, she's been working for years to help traditional farmers meet those guidelines and qualify so that their produce can be used in school meals. But it's part of a whole re-education effort where we're even having to re-educate the educators and the decision makers around the history of why diets are so poor on the reservation. Because there's this assumption, and we've seen this over and over again with different programs that come in, that fruits and vegetables just need to be added more to our children's diets, and that's what we need our farmers to grow: tomatoes, apples, oranges. But like Kern said, we have traditional foods that are much better, much higher in nutrient content, and that are familiar and have entire stories and histories with the families of our children in our schools. And so being able to use traditional foods, which aren't regulated by USDA guidelines, and required them to work for the last 10-20 years to really challenge and amend and develop new guidelines that are still going through the process of being approved.
And then, just to go off this question that Valerie asked, I think is a really good question. I think that a lot of times when we start talking about food, farm to school and this kind of like farm to table kind of thing, it's really important that we understand and acknowledge that like being a farmer isn't just something people can jump into. It's like not that it's like work, but it's a thing that like you do and you develop. And a lot of times, you're talking about like the school gardens being used. I feel like a lot of times like schools and or communities think that whoever they have as like their PEP worker or their maintenance person, it's just going to be like keeping the farms going or keeping these gardening plots going. And if you don't know about gardening, it's not something you can just like willy-nilly do. And it's definitely things you can engage in with the kids, but like in terms of during the summertime when people aren't there, we've been working on trying to create these like master gardening programs where people who are gardeners can go in and work with our school kids. And that creates like, more red tape of clearances and things like that. But to us, it's really important because as we've seen in the past where you go to some community and you create a garden and then you say, who's going to maintain it? And they're like, oh, well, this the groundskeeper will maintain it. And the groundskeeper has no idea about gardening, right? Like has no idea about farming. And then the garden like falls into disrepair. So looking at things like that, I think are really important in terms of how do we provide resources to keep these things going. Again, a lot of times in indigenous communities, a lot of times in poor communities, in Black communities, it's like, we're going to start a community garden and everyone's going to volunteer, right? And it's like people are struggling to pay their bills, right? Like volunteering is kind of like a luxury thing, right? Like volunteering is like one of those luxury things. So how do you provide resources for it? And like in the Eurocentric world, our farmers have a plethora of resources, right? From like farm bills, which recently there's, I think, the courts, I don't know if it was 2020 or just this year, where they allocated a bunch of funding to Black and Indigenous farmers because of the decades of them not being able to access those resources, right? And it's just, same thing with the GI Bill. So when we say like, how come these communities aren't doing these things, and then when you look and see where the resources are going, it's, well, of course we have no money to hire people. And again, in the Eurocentric world, we have all these migrant laborers. We have like all this money to get people tractors and tools and all these subsidies. But when it comes to like our communities, it's like, why are you not doing it on your own? And again, like we need to start looking at those type of systems that are put in place.
Oh, thank you guys. Thank you both so much. I wish that we can take time for one more question. We know that our meeting ends at 10:30, so if anyone has to go, we completely understand. But if anyone else has like a burning question that they really want to come off of mute or put into the chat, we invite you to do that now. Okay. Looks like.
Thanks, everyone.
I just want to say something really quickly. I don't have a question formulated just yet because I have so many thoughts running through my head, but I will say there's something that struck me, and I would love to get more information around, is something that Janine said about the nonprofit organizations getting access to the funding, and how that decision making process happens, and how it doesn't necessarily flow into the areas that need to for the money to flow into. I know for me, I would say that is definitely an area that I don't know 100% on and would love to know more information on. So I guess that's my major, I have a big question mark on that, but love to know more.
Yeah, for sure. I think that, the whole nonprofit structure in and of itself is like really interesting. In my opinion, community-led nonprofits are a thing that have been created because, as these community people are doing these things and you can't get access to resources, it's always like, what's your DUNS number? What's your EIN number when you're filling out these things? And, we're talking about community farmers and they don't have these things. But as you're trying to do more and more things, you start to jump into that. But I've worked in like nonprofits, and, I've seen it personally where a nonprofit will go after a USDA grant for $2 million to do farm to school. And the person that they have in the community doing the actual farm to school work is making $15,000 off of that grant, while like the EDs are written in there, and the EDs have their salaries completely covered, right? Like 200,000. And it's just like, again, like, how do you value the actual work, right? Like, how do you value who is doing the work? And a lot of times, like my new thing is like, when it comes to food security, the further you are away from actual labor is the more you get paid.
Yep.
Amen.
Absolutely. All right. It's so hard for me to end this here because I feel like, we could keep talking all morning, and there's just so much to learn and so much to be shared.
Don't fall into the trap, Naira. I'm from the Caribbean and I can talk forever. So good thing that you're cutting it off.
I know I can talk forever too. It's like, I think everybody else here can too. And I'm just going to echo Dawn. She just said, thank you so much, Janine and Kerr, and really appreciate you spending time with us so early this morning. Yeah, we know that it's a time difference where you all are, and we really appreciate you being here. We learned a lot from you today, and we hope that, you continue to stay within our network, and, we continue to stay connected to you both. We definitely should talk about, how we can do that. But trying to figure out the best way to close it out. All I can really say is just thank you. And then there's so many thank yous in the chat too. All right. Awesome. Well, feel free to stay on for the rest of the meeting, for the rest of the closeout. I'm just going to put some links in the chat, but we hope you guys have a great rest of your day. Janine, I hope that the cast, when it comes off, your arm is back in full effect. And I'll make sure I follow up with you guys later too. Awesome. Bye. All right, everyone. I'm just gonna go into gallery view. As promised, I just want to put this link in the chat for people who are interested in being an education action team leader. So feel free to fill out that interest form at your earliest convenience. We hope to get someone in that role by the end of July or mid-July. We don't really have an exact date on it yet, but I'm just going to quickly share my screen. Dawn, I don't know if you have the presentation up. I do. Just a reminder, so our next meeting is July 21st, Wednesday, July 21st. We didn't get time to do open mic today, but hopefully everyone here is on our Google group. So please do use the Google group if you have any updates. It gets emailed to over 160 people who are a part of this Connecticut Farm to School network. So that's a great place for you to add your updates. And I know a lot of you already use it, but just as a reminder. And also, if you have any ideas for people who we can bring to our next collaborative meeting on July 21st, we're always looking for new presenters. So send Dawn or I an email about that as well. And I think that's it. Dawn, if you want to add anything.
I'm good. Thank you. Thanks everyone for hanging in there for an extra 12 minutes. Really appreciate it. Hopefully you found it worth it.
Right.
Great meeting.
Awesome. Thanks, Val. Have a great day.
Take care.